Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
And I'm Tom Sholey.
It's been a little while since we did shoot interviews on the regular, so we have to do them up big, man. Frank Quitely. Congratulations, Tom. Your first shoot interview with us. The great Frank Quitely is in the house, man. I consider the dude a unicorn because of all the disciplines that are involved in the art of making comics. A lot of cartoonists can be good at one or two things. When you get a guy who's good at about five things: cool drawing, a bankable style, composition, storytelling flow, clarity. When you get a guy who can do all those things, man, you got to call him a unicorn. Frank Quitely's in the house. Jimmy, rattle off a little bit of that bibliography and let's get started.
Oh man, Jupiter's Legacy, Batman and Robin, All-Star Superman, I feel like changed superhero comics. We Three, amazing. Sandman with Neil Gaiman, he had done Endless Nights a chapter, New X-Men, Authority. It's a list of some of the most influential superhero comics of the last 3 decades, and certainly game-changing, as you say, Ed. Some style things that we hadn't really seen before, and I think a giant influence on where comics are these days. So this is fantastic. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Well, thanks. Great to be here.
Frank, we did a lot of research, man. We always prep a lot when these interviews are about to go down, and I listened to that conversation you had with Brian Stelfreeze, the shot by shot podcast. And you mentioned going to being sort of obsessive compulsive about your storytelling to the point where a couple of guys nudged it to go see a hypnotherapist or something. But my question, we could talk about that.
A couple of guys, Mark Miller, by the way.
Yeah.
He is a couple of guys.
we could go down that route, but specifically this past week, I had a conversation, Jeff Darrow, man. I woke up from a nightmare, dripping sweat. And the nightmare was that the lettering in my comic was bad. And then he said, I have a reoccurring dream. I'm drawing the same sailboat and it's coming out wrong. It's a panel in a comic and I draw this sailboat and the wind isn't catching it and everything is wrong. And I wake up in a cold sweat. So first question, Frank, have you ever had process and comic book related dreams / nightmares? And can you lay one or two of those things out for us?
Yeah, the biggest one was I had a job to do outside of comics, and it was for an album cover with a guy called Robbie Williams, who's really big in the UK. He read The Invisibles and got obsessed with Grant Morrison, started a friendship with Grant, and he had a new album coming out, and he wanted Grant to be involved with the album cover, and they came up with the idea between them to do tarot cards, and but Grant insisted that he needed me to do the drawings, and Robbie knew my work from We Three and All Star, so he was fine with that, and but Robbie's people were like, we can't go for comic book drawings on an album cover. We need photographs. Robbie's fans want a photograph. They don't want a drawing. So they got back to me and they said I could do all the drawings and all the painting, but I had to incorporate photographs. And the easiest way to do it was, they asked me if I could work with Photoshop. And I was like, well, I'm just starting, but I know a guy, Jamie Grant, who colored All-Star Superman and We Three. I said, I've got a friend who's much more proficient with storytelling, so I can with Photoshop, so I can subcontract the Photoshop work with him. So like they were fine with that. So I said, Jamie ran a studio in Hope Street in the centre of Glasgow, and I worked from home. And I said to Jamie, I've got this big album cover job. Can you do the Photoshop stuff? And he said, listen, why don't you rent a desk here for 2 months? And instead of me just doing the work, you can sit beside me, tell me what you want me to do, and I'll tell you what I'm doing, and you'll learn Photoshop. And I was like, right. And once I started learning Photoshop, it was like a door opening. It was this seemingly limitless toolbox. And for a period of about 6 months at least, maybe a year, I would regularly get dreams where I was making selections and performing actions, and things would go wrong, and I I was wrestling with it. I'd wake up thinking, I know how to do that, you know, and it was just constant. It was a couple of times a week I was dreaming about doing things. I made loads of images in Photoshop in my dreams, which have never been realized. But and it's just because I was obviously, I suppose I started at an age where I was already in my 40s, I think, and it's amazing the way you get slower and slower at learning as you get older, like learning new skills. And it was obviously using up so much of my brain power that it took over completely. And just on the subject of how long it takes me to learn stuff, Jamie taught me for a couple of months the basics of Photoshop. And for another 6 months, I worked with this and learned how to become proficient at doing the stuff that I needed for the kind of work that I was doing. And I've got 2 big sisters, and my oldest sister has 2 sons, both grown up now, and one of them needed work experience. And work experience is a thing over here where after high school you get a placement at a place of work, and you do it for a week. And Declan came in, and my sister said, could Declan come and work in your studio? And I was like, I didn't really. Everybody in Hope Street Studio was always like smoking weed and drinking during the day and stuff. And this was my nephew was like 16. I was like, oh man. So I told everybody to behave, and I got him in. And so the first day, I was busy and I couldn't really be bothered teaching him anything. But I wanted him to have something to do. So I said, well, I'll show you some of the stuff I know how to do in Photoshop. So I showed him something that I had learned, and he was like, oh, right. So he listened to what I'd said, and then he did it. And then I said, well, do that a couple of times. And he said, what else have you got? And I was like, well, and this is what I learned the second month, you know, and everything that I had learned in 6 months, he learned in about a day and a half. I was so demoralized. I was like, I'm just like, you know, I'm like, oh. Anyway, yeah, I've had plenty of dreams about Photoshop, yeah.
That's a funny thing to dream about. But since you bring up Photoshop, are there any other software that you use in your process these days?
Yeah, I've got Clip Studio as well. And I'm totally useless with Clip Studio. I don't actually know how to use it. I don't know how to set up a page. I don't know how to have different panels and different folders and stuff like that. All I can do is, and I can never even remember the name of the pens and brushes that I like best. I've just got to go in and try them all. And then once I've got it, I turn down all the controls to 0, because I don't want the thing that smooths out your lines or finishes off the ticks at the end or whatever. And I can draw line work with it, but then I do all the colouring in Photoshop. But I still, for the most part, I still work the finished artwork that gets printed. Most of what I do on paper. So typically, I'll have a script, and I'll read it through and thumbnail it on the margins of the script, and then I'll draw out the page or the cover in Photoshop just because it's really rough, and I'll print that out in for our sizes it's A3, but it's just roughly the size of an 11x17, and I'll print that out in cyan, and then I'll go in with a technical pencil and draw it up, scan it in, sharpen it up a bit, flat it and colour it in Photoshop. And I meant to rewatch the Kayfabes that you've done about my work, because I didn't have time. I actually wanted to make a list of points that I wanted to talk to you about, but one of them was you were talking about the size of the pencil that I use, and it's a 0.7. I always use a 0.7 technical pencil, and you know, you can roll it onto its edge to get a sharper line, or you can lean more lightly, you know, but it's always a 0.7. Occasionally, I used to use a 0.5 and a 0.7, but I just always use a 0.7 now.
That's fascinating, because I remember when that would come up, we would just see these very, very fine, tiny perfectly proportioned faces that just feel impossible to do with something like even a 0.7, which would lead me to ask, do you have one of those jeweler's loop giant magnifying glass things on your drafting board?
No, I don't. And it's a good thing I don't, because when I work digitally, and I've heard you guys talk about it before, that thing about zooming in, I know there's a way you can set a limit on it, but I've done stuff, like I've been working in things, and I've been zoomed in and I'm drawing a crowd scene in the background, and everybody's got a facial expression and people are looking at each other, and folk are yawning and stuff. And then you zoom out and you're like, that's like about an inch of real estate on the printed page. We're not going to see any. And the other thing I do is, because I do my blue line underdrawing digitally now, I'll go in and do all this stuff in the background, and I print the thing out, and I get my 0.7 technical pencil, and I'm like, I can't really make that out anymore. And I know there's loads of detail in there, but it's so frustrating.
I don't exactly know how the Cintiq works, if you could do like the Apple kind of pinch zoom, but I'll do my blue line layouts on the iPad, where you can do that pinch zoom. And sometimes when I get into a super fine detail, and I do the same thing, transfer the blue lines to a piece of paper, and I'm looking at the paper, and I go to the fucking paper and go like this,
Yeah.
and nothing happens.
Right.
Did you ever, because you use Photoshop and Clip Studio and things to do the blue lines, do you ever hit a phantom Apple Z?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's so embarrassing, because I have a studio full of people here, and like I'll do these things and then just turn bright red and look around and just see if people saw me do that.
That's funny. I do that. I'll double tap, because I do the same thing, like print out the blue line and then I'm inking, and it's like, oh, that's a bad line. Like, tap it.
Nothing happens. Yeah.
So disappointing. I want to talk about pencils a little bit. So is All-Star Superman the first book where you go to pencil as like the finished line?
Nearly. The first time was on New X-Men, and when I started with New X-Men, the inker was Tim Townsend, and I checked out Tim Townsend online, and I was really delighted, because Tim's stuff looks amazing on Joe Quesada and the Cubic Brothers and a bunch of other people that I saw him on. And when I got the pages back, it kind of wasn't what I wanted. And to my lasting embarrassment, I actually wrote a letter or an email to Tim, kind of like with a scan of my pencils and a scan of the inks that he'd done. And there was a scene where Emma Frost was in the back of a chauffeur-driven car, and she was leaving the school thing, and I should know the name of it.
School.
And the wall, I had penciled the wall. It was all these kind of like irregular stones, and I had used like a thin pencil for the top half of the stone and a thick soft pencil for the bottom half of the stone, and to try and mimic what I wanted done with the inks. And I was being kind of precious about it, because I wanted it. I wasn't used to working with inkers. I had an inker for the first time ever on The Invisibles, and John Stokes, and I had Trevor Scott on The Authority. And for both of them, I ended up doing much, much tighter pencils, because I wanted them to do what I wanted. I'm not that much of a team player, and so I was doing these pencils that I felt looked like different line weights. And it turns out what I found from the editor was that most inkers, when they get a penciled page in, they use a putty rubber and try and remove as much of the the graphite as possible before they start inking. So all the thick soft lines that were like a 6B or whatever were just lifted straight off, and all the thin hard lines with the HB or the 2H were left, and that's where the miscommunication was happening. But it's funny because when Grant and I talked about doing the X-Men at first, Grant was taking it really seriously. He's like, "This is a big deal, Vin. You know, we need to do this justice. People aren't going to like it because it's going to be different." And I thought I felt quite relaxed about it, like it wasn't a big deal. And then when I went back and reread the letter that I had written to Tim, I was like, my God, I was so uptight about this. I cared so much that this looked good, you know? But another thing that happened was that I think there was 6 or 8 inkers credited with inking New X-Men, but there was a good few extras that were involved because lots of the inkers had assistants, and I would sometimes meet guys at cons and they'd come up and say, "I inked 4 of your pages," you know, and there was a guy called Dan Green who inked some of my New X-Men work, and Dan Green had the kind of looseness and confidence that I don't have when I'm inking. It wasn't slick and smooth. It was chunky and organic, like the guy was a painter or something. And I loved Dan Green's inks. And I asked the editor on several occasions, could Dan Green not do more of it? And this is no disrespect to Tim Townsend or Mark Morales or any of the other guys that inked me, but I just, personal taste, I loved what Dan Green was doing. And like the editor was like, Dan's busy. He's got better things to do. And it turns out the guy who was who was selling my original artwork at the time, a guy called Mitch Itkowitz, it turns out that Mitch was really good friends with Dan Green, and Mitch said to me one day, you know, like, did you not like Dan Green inking you? And I was like, God, yeah, Dan was my favourite. And he was like, why didn't you ask for more of him? And I was like, I did, but the editor told me he was busy doing better things. And Mitch was like that. It was like one of the top books. What better things could he possibly have been doing? He said he was doing Dead Man for DC, which he didn't want to be doing. And he kept asking, like, could I not do more of Quitely stuff? I really like his pencils. But you know, that's the way these things happen when you've got no control over them, you know.
I love this story. Dan Green was one of my first favorite inkers. Not that I ever worked with him, but as a reader, like he did X-Men when I started reading X-Men in like late 80s, early 90s over Mark Silvestri. They would do like bi-weekly issues, and it looked like he was inking very fast.
40 pages a month.
But it looked amazing. It's exactly as you describe it. So that's awesome. Wow, there's a couple of places I want to go there. One is about control that you have over creative teams, but I want to stay on this pencil thing for a little bit because you make this transition into doing pencil art that's reproduced from the pencils, and I think it flatters digital coloring in a way that might be the best way to do digital coloring and line work. And I wonder a little bit about how that process happens, how you get that confidence, if it's working closely with Jamie Grant and seeing like, you know, how this looks on screen. Like, can you talk about that transition? Because that's pretty high profile books that you're making a big style change on.
It's funny, there's a couple of points here. One is that what you've just said reminded me of your last question and how I only answered half of it. So during New X-Men, there was one story arc that I asked, can I just pencil this and we color the pencils? So that was the first time. Then it was We Three, then it was All-Star Superman. I've heard you, Jim, speaking before about how digital colouring or digital painting, maybe we should call it, has become sophisticated to the point where it's almost gone beyond the traditional inking, like line heavy inking with spotted blacks of mainstream comics. or indeed of indie comics, of comics in general, that solid ink line works very well with flat color or with a certain amount of digital modeling or shading, or call it what you will. But when the digital painting gets to the point where it's doing a lot of the work, I agree with you that maybe either the finer pencil line or the looser, less finished pencil line, the sketchier work, maybe works better with the digital painting. I absolutely agree with that. As for kind of finding my feet with that on a All-Star Superman and We Three with Jamie Grant, after I'd done New X-Men, and I wasn't on that for any specific length of time, I was just, Grant wanted me to do the first 3 and then just do whatever I could after that. And I was happy to keep doing it. I was really enjoying it. I thought Grant's stories were tremendous. But I got the offer from, it was either Karen Berger or Shelley Bond. I think it was Karen, to do the Endless Nights short, the Destiny chapter, just 8 pages. And I had the opportunity to paint it. So what I used to do when I started on the Judge Dredd magazine, I would do my penciling and inking on watercolor paper, and then I would use watercolors, colored inks, liquid acrylics, and gouache. I do all the coloring, and then I'd have to go in again with like fine liners and stuff and go over the line work, especially the outlines, because if I'd use gouache for a really matte background, it would cover it. You know, I just had to, it was a really laborious process. And when I did the Sandman short, I basically penciled it and pulled out key lines with inks, and then and I kind of painted it with watercolors and colored inks and a few like Pantone markers, and I thought there's definitely a way of doing this where you have, it's like, you know, when you see those Miyazaki books, the art books. I got one for My Neighbor Totoro at a Comic Con. I can't remember where it was, somewhere in the States, and it's all in Japanese, so I don't know anything that's going on. But there's loads of beautiful loose pencil sketches that just have like washes of watercolor over them, and I'm like, oh, I'd love to do a comic like that. So there was an element of that in the Sandman pages, but when I came to working with Jamie Grant, I was like, I'm doing these penciled pages, and I was still at Hope Street at that. I was in Hope Street for years. After the 2 months that I was meant to be there for the Robbie Williams job, as soon as I went there, my wife was just like, pack up your stuff, you messy bugger. I want my house back. And so I was in Hope Street Studios and I was working alongside Jamie. And for the most part, it was good. You know, like, we worked well together. Jamie was very accommodating. But Jamie's got slightly different aesthetic tastes from me. He's really, really drawn to very, very saturated palettes, and I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum. And after a while, it became a kind of struggle. Like when we were doing All Star Superman, when we were doing We Three, like I really sat beside Jamie the whole time, saying, no, rein it back in, do this, do that. And it used up so much of my time. And so when we did All Star Superman, I thought maybe it was time for a change of colorist. And he's a good friend and he's a really talented guy. But because our working relationship had used up so much of my time, I thought it was time for a change. But Grant loved We Three so much, they said, no, you and Jamie have got to keep working together. I thought, you know what, Jamie likes a saturated color, and that's going to suit Superman better. So maybe this is going to be okay. But as Jamie did the pages, I was like, some of these colors are too strong for my delicate line work. This needs to get pushed back a bit. And Jamie had a bit of a habit of being really kind of like really obliging and compliant and going, no bother, I get what you mean. Yeah, I'll do that. And then he wouldn't do it. And you'd say, Jamie, you didn't do that. And he'd be like, did we talk about that? Oh, come on. And so Jamie did this thing where once he'd finished every page, he would flatten all the layers together, copy the layer, hit multiply, and then just slide the opacity of the new layer down until he felt it was vibrant enough. And so much as a lot of people love All Star, it's too vibrant for me. It's too much. I mean, like the Bizarro World stuff is just like the colors are like so intense you can hardly see the line work at points. But that said, just as a qualifier, my years spent working with Jamie in Hope Street Studios were years that I'll cherish for the rest of my life. So it's not all bad, but yeah, it was just a question of finding our feet and finding a balance, and working things out together.
Is this why you had Flex Metallo recolored?
Oh, do you know that's another thing on my the list I meant to write.
We're laughing just because we saw an interview you did where you mentioned the thing, and then it's like, oh no, we're that guy. Like we're the guy that we always remember from our comments who says one thing that like sticks in your craw too long or something. So yeah, please accept that.
No, there's a couple of different points to make here. One of them is, like with the George Lucas thing, there is something kind of difficult about when anybody makes a piece of work and then revisits it later and makes changes. There is something fundamentally problematic about that. I feel that. I get it. I know why other people don't like it. The thing about Flex Mentallo, and I totally get what you guys have said on a number of occasions about a number of different things about modern comic book coloring and how it's often so brown. And I don't think it's just brown. I think it's because of the four colors black is used in a lot of the color choices. In Hope Street, there's a really good artist called Dominic Reagan. He does a ton of indie stuff, and Dom uses a palette in Photoshop that's got 64 colors, and that's what he sticks to. And those 64 colors are made up of C, M, and Y. There's no K in any of them. There's no black in any of those colors. So the only black that's on the pages and the line work and the lettering, and that's the way Dom likes it. And I used to think he was being overly prescriptive. And the number of comics that I've seen and the number of covers that I've colored, which I look back on later and think, yeah, those colors are a bit muddy. I totally get what he's talking about. The thing about Flex is when Grant and I spoke about Flex, we had this idea that there was two basic worlds. There was the real world, which was a fictionalized version of Glasgow, which is a rainy, grey, dismal place. I mean, it's vital and interesting and funny and dangerous, and it's an amazing place. But we're used to kind of silver grey skies, light grey skies, dark grey skies. Like we have subtle colours over here, and then there was the world of Wally Sage's imagination and the comics that he'd made up, and that was your old-fashioned comic books. And what we both were absolutely in tune with was the idea that we had two very distinctive color palettes, and one of them was a very desaturated, subtle, nuanced, natural for Glasgow kind of palette, and then you had something that was reminiscent of old-fashioned comics. And through, I don't know how many different editors were on Flex. There might have been 4 or 5, but that never got translated to the, this was before, like, maybe the internet started back then, it was the mid-90s, but I wasn't online then. I was still using fax machines and telephones, landlines. So Tom McGraw was chosen as a colorist. I think he'd been doing Legion of Superheroes at the time. And so he was absolutely adept at dealing with scores of heroes in the one panel, making sure that these costumes look the same all the time. And I think he'd been working with Tom Grummett, and I don't know, but he was chosen because they reckoned he would be really good for the superhero stuff. And in fairness to Tom, as far as I'm aware, none of what Grant and I wanted in terms of the way it was to be coloured made its way to him. And when it got once it came out, it wasn't collected because of the problems with the Charles Atlas Company. And when eventually that got sorted, I think it was after Paul Levitz had left, and they got in touch and they said they were going to bring out a collected like a trade paperback, and Grant and I spoke to each other, and we were like, maybe this is the time to get it recolored the way we wanted it. And we spoke to Peter Doherty about recoloring it for us. And for the most part, I prefer what Peter did to the original issues. But there are bits that are maybe a bit murky, certainly. But for the most part, I think it suits the mood and the tone and the point of the story better than the original colouring. But I do totally understand why people who bought the single issues and it meant something to them and it made an impact and they loved it and they were in early, that way when you discover a band before they break, and then you see a collected thing that's recolored, and it's like, I understand why not everybody likes the way it's been redone, but on balance, I prefer the new coloring.
I was reviewing it because I thought this topic might come up, and I noticed, the other thing that's really different in the recolor is the coloring's a lot more modeled. There's a lot more gradients and sort of that digital painting style applied, and I don't know how much I process that whenever I'm looking at one and saying I prefer this treatment or that treatment, but that's definitely a major visual difference, having those, using more of a digital painting approach. Even if you were using the same palette, it would make a very different appearance on the page. It's an interesting topic. I'm sure it's not going away anytime too soon because you see it in reprints, It's a topic that I see people bring up a lot in terms of reprints of old comics and how those are approached. We talked to Brian Boland, who, recolored Killing Joke, and we didn't bring it up because I had read or maybe saw in an interview where he talked about he wanted it colored a certain way in the beginning, and it was colored. It was like his ideas were just disregarded in that first color job. And that makes sense to me. You have a vision for how you want this to look. And if it doesn't look that way, it's probably never going to quite measure up to what you wanted originally. My takeaway from that and from your comments, Frank, is it breaks my heart to think about how much effort goes into these comics or used to go into these comics. And then it's not even relayed to the colorist. It's so frustrating to me to think fans care so much, the creators care so much. And then somewhere in there is a wall. Is somebody that just doesn't care at all, that doesn't relay this stuff.
We'll call them the editor very often. And there's somebody in town who she was writing something for Marvel. She didn't even know if she was allowed to talk to the pencilers or inkers. She was new to the game and didn't even know if she could get fired for that, man. So they they're trying to keep, they don't want people to hook up, man, and go create a Jupiter's Legacy over an Image or something.
Do you know, every comic page, because I used to do the inking as well as the penciling, and nearly every page of originals that I've got, all round the four margins of the comic board, I would write my color notes, and it seemed to me that they were almost universally ignored. And it was when I was doing The Authority, and it was John Layman who was editing, and something had come back. It was David Barron that was doing the colouring, and something came back that was just so different from what I had asked for in the colouring notes. And I brought it up with Layman, and John Layman's a great guy. I mean, and so is David Barron. I got on super well with both of them. And I was like, John, like, how could this have happened? And he said, oh yeah, you write your colour notes in the margins. He said, yeah, what happens is the pages come in, and get scanned, and then they're trimmed to fit the template. So anything you write outside the crop marks, the colorist doesn't see that. And I've been doing this for like 20 years. I'm like, you are kidding me on? And he's like, yeah. If you want the colorist to know, like what you want, you need to either get in touch with them directly or tell your editor and ask them to pass it on. And I've worked, how many editors had I worked with? And nobody had ever mentioned that before. Like, they just see the original, because I used to FedEx the originals over, and they would just see all these color notes around, and they'd just pass them on to whoever it does the scanning. And you're just like, oh,
there's just some graphomania or something. Just
And meanwhile, you're probably sitting back home going, "Why is this colorist ignoring me?"
I know.
But you said you had the colorist sitting next to you on All-Star Superman and still not doing what you wanted. So I think it just comes down to, like, if you really, really care about this stuff, nobody else can like read your mind. So you just kind of have to take matters into your own hands and just like, color your own stuff or whatever, whenever able.
That's it. Do it yourself. That's exactly it. Yeah. So that was one of the reasons I liked the Sandman thing. It's because everything in the page, apart from the writing, was me. And it's why I want to get back to, because I used to do that in Electric Soup, the adult underground comedy comic thing we used to do, and I would write, draw, letter, zip-a-tone, you name it, spot color, and I would really like to get back to. I've written a bunch of short stories that I would like to draw, and I would really like to get back to just doing everything myself, partly for the reason of getting exactly the way I want it, and partly just for the joy of sitting doing my own thing,
I'll mention it now. You did a TED Talk where you talk about some of the things that you can do in comics that other media can't do, and great talk. I encourage everybody to go check that out. But I thought of this as a fourth piece, and it is that one person can make a comic, or a couple of people can make a comic, and it really is a way to do as close to one person's vision into like a reader's hands or into a reader's minds as you can get. When you think about film or video game or something, there are so many hands necessary that it's not the same. I think that's a major strength in comics. So I hope that you will do, write your own stories, do everything yourself. I think that would be amazing to see for fans.
It's funny, Jim, you actually, in one of the, I think I've watched every Kayfabe thing you guys have done.
Sorry.
Yeah, but one of you mentioned this before, and I've totally lost the thread of what I was saying. What did you just say there?
Oh, how great comics!
Sorry, I was out for lunch and I had a drink, and I'm very slightly foggy.
But comics, one person can make a comic, and it's a unique vision as a result. Yeah,
yeah. I I had a really interesting point to make about that I've forgotten.
Come
It'll
back to
me.
that. Come back to that. Let me throw you a softball real quick, just because you brought up the Sandman collaboration with Neil Gaiman. Frank, were you the first choice to draw the Destiny strip?
I think you know that I wasn't the first choice. Yeah, the way I heard it, Karen Berger said to Neil Gaiman, "What do we need to do to get you to come back from writing your best-selling books and do some more Sandman for us?" And he said, "Get me my international dream team of artists." And it was Milo Manara and Michelangelo Prado and Mobius and a few others. And Mobius's health wasn't good, and they said, I don't know if it was his wife or somebody else, but somebody said, like, listen, don't make it longer than 8 pages, and either give him splash pages or splash pages with an inset panel. Don't do anything more complicated than that. And Neil wrote this 8-page story about Destiny, and it turned out that Mobius wasn't fit enough to do it, and they needed to find somebody else. And either Karen or Shelley got in touch with me, and I dealt with both of them at the time. So I came on board and I got this 8-page script, and it was just perfect. It was so economically written. It was a really, really short, simple script. The description for each page or panel was really simple, economically evocative. You know, it made you think of the type of scene you had to draw without spelling out any detail. And the dialogue or narrative was poetic, and it mirrored what he was asking for in the images without without repeating it. And it's, I read through it a couple of times and I could just see it all in my mind. And I made up some relatively simple roughs for the 8 pages that, if they were accepted, I could blow them up and trace them through onto watercolor paper and actually work on them. So, I mean, they were pretty close to what I ended up with, but I sent the roughs in and they were just like, yeah, this is great. And I worked it up on watercolor paper, and I just spent time making it look the way I want, and making it look the way I wanted to make it. But I hadn't actually done any painting for more than 10 years at that time. So when I look at it, I can see how uptight some of it is. I can see the parts that are really overworked, There's not a single thing I've ever done that I wouldn't improve on if I did it again. Not a single thing. I've got nothing out there that I'm 100% happy with. I've got stuff out there that I'm proud of, and I've got stuff out there that I'm ashamed of. But I really, really enjoyed doing it. It was a lovely script to work with. I was in great company, and I really enjoyed doing it. And I'm mostly happy with the way it turned out. And I would love to do more stuff like that.
I have a follow-up. I have the real question, actually. I just needed you to set us up so that I could ask if you knew the Mobius part of it before you received your script, and 2, if that was the case and you did know, was there a bigger sense of intimidation going into that script, knowing that you had these shoes to fill, or just another day in the office?
Yeah, I knew. They told me that. They actually told me that the story about Neil giving his international dream team and they spelled out the dream team. And I was like, wait, I'm not on that dream team. And they're like, yeah, Mobius can't do it. Would you be interested in doing that one? It's only 8 pages. You know, as if, and they were offering it to me like it was just another job kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, definitely. And I had to, you know, like I had read a bunch of things that Neil had written. I'd read some Sandman, but not all of it. And it was Shelley that sent me all the books. And I, very fortunately, just before I got started, I came down with some sort of bug, and I was in bed for a week, which was the first time in years that I had a week off. And I had this bundle of Sandman trade paperbacks, and I remember reading the first one and thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to get through this. This is fucking torture. It was just, the first book, I was just like, this is not my kind of thing. And as it went on, I get more and more into it, and I ended up totally loving it. None of which really helped with working on the. I mean, I could, knowing what the characters looked like, I could have started on that 8-pager just from Neil's script, but knowing that Neil had thought that he was going to get Mobius, I sat and thought about that for a while, and it was like, if I thought I was going to get Mobius to draw a story that I had written, and then he couldn't do it, how many other artists are there in the world, dead or alive, that would kind of be a good substitute for him? You know? And I just thought this isn't a healthy way of thinking about it. And I thought, they're not getting Mobius, they're getting me, and I'm not doing my usual penciling and inking with somebody I don't know coloring me. So I'm just going to do it in watercolor paper. I'll do the best I can, and it'll, you know, and it's always the same. It's like you get a script and you read it and you have a picture in your mind how it could go. And with me, I really like, nothing comes easily to me. You know, I look at Alex Toth and I just think that looks like loads of it comes easily to you because you're a genius. Same with Mobius. It might be the same with Katsuhiro Tomo. These guys just do what they do. And for me, I do loads of things that don't look very good, and I have to keep redrawing them, and I can't get this face right, or I can't get this position right, or I can't get this facial expression right, you know, and I've just got to keep working at it, and then I'm worried it's overworked, and then I have to go away and get up the next morning and look at it again, and it's just, you know, it's people like Mobius are in a different league from everybody else. Like everybody else, you know, there's a very, very small number of people who are up there at the top. And most of the rest of us will never be in that area. But you can either think, well, what's the point in doing it at all? Or you can think, well, you know, the stuff that I do appeals to some people. It'll inspire some younger guys. Some of the stuff that inspired me when I was a child or when I was a teenager isn't in the same ballpark as Otomo and Toth and Mobius and Jack Davis and Mort Drucker and all the other guys that really inspired me. Lots of it's journeymen that were just doing their thing, and I was just young, and they were better at drawing than I was, and they still inspired me. And, you know, you're just a link in a chain. So I think that thing about, well, this is as good as I can do, and you either do the best you can do or you just rattle the stuff out, you know. And I'm from the school of doing the best I can do. And I know I'm not as good as them, but, you know, like, that story could have been done by Mobius, and it might have been perfect. It might have been his best thing ever, you know. But it wasn't. That's not the way it turned out. It was drawn by me, and I did the best that I could do, and it's what it is, you know. I wish it was Mobius that drew it, you know, I'm glad that I drew it, you know, and I'm glad that I put as much work into it as I could, because it wasn't a giant page rate and it took me fucking ages, you know, because I hadn't painted for so long, you know, and I'm glad I did it. And I'm glad that so many people over the years at cons have come up and said, "Oh, I totally love that story you did." You know, it's that's a great reward, you know. I could have been working in a deli or driving a van, you know. Nobody's going to come up and thank me for what I'd done, you know. I mean, it's like you need to kind of keep these things in perspective, you know. But it was cool. I loved the script. I loved the fact that I got the chance to do it. I thought about the fact that Mobius was meant to have been doing it, and I tried not to dwell on it, you know.
I guess the irony is that it's like we can't get Frank Quitely to draw our comic. So there's an army of like Frank Quitely wannabes that can sort of like fill in the gap.
Absolutely. I went to school in 2000, comic book school, Joe Kubert School, and the Authority was hitting. It was year 2000. Authority was just coming out in like trades, like 99, 2000. A lot of widescreen, Frank Quitely, Dutch angle, kind of Authority action amongst my brethren.
Frank, did you know Mobius? Were you two friendly?
No. One of the early conventions I went to down in London that was called UCAC, United Kingdom Comic Art Convention. I don't know why they called it UCAC.
What does like CAC is that's a British kind of slang. What does it mean?
It means shit. Yeah. So yeah. UCAC was a really bad name. There's one in the Lakes, and it's the Lakes International Comic Art Festival, which is LICAF. And you're like, seriously? LICAF? You're like, wait. Did you not think about that before you did all
the creative people are under the tent.
Yeah.
Behind the table.
I went to a convention in the early 90s in London, one of the UCACs. It was an Englishman that lived in Glasgow called Frank Plowright, and he did the London convention, and he also did a Glasgow convention. And the London convention made a decreasing profit every year, and the Glasgow convention made an increasing loss every year, until eventually he got to the stage where he was like, I need to stop doing this altogether. But I sat in an audience and watched Mobius being interviewed, and they had a giant screen, and they were showing examples of his work, and there was an interpreter, and he was talking, and it was fascinating. I'd only been in comics a few years at the time. I can't remember if I was still doing Electric Soup, which I did from 89 to 92 or 93, or if I'd started working with Judge Dredd magazine. But I was right at the start of my career, and I had seen a bunch of Blueberry books, and I'd seen the Incal books, and I'd seen a few collections of Jean Giraud and Mobius stuff. So I had a pretty big. I hadn't seen everything that he'd done, but I'd seen a lot of his body of work, and I was super impressed. I mean, he was like totally like one of my favorites, if not my favorite. And it was really cool to just be sitting in the audience, seeing him there, hearing him talk. But the thing is, I've never really had this thing about meeting my heroes. I know there's that thing people always say about, like, never meet your heroes because they'll always let you down. And then there's all these other people who do meet their heroes, and it's really great because this guy who's brilliant at whatever also turns out to be a nice person, or but I've never really had that thing about I had to be in the company or shake the hand or be introduced or recognized by the person that whose work I liked so much. But it was really nice to sit in the audience and actually see the guy. I'd seen him in videos. I was fairly familiar with a good amount of his work. I was absolutely in awe of his talent, which I still am. And it was just really nice to sit there and hear him talking about what it is he does. And then he had that big exhibition in Paris, Transform, I think it was called. A few years before he died, and I had wanted to go and see it, and my wife was like, just go and see it. And we didn't have a lot of money, and it just seemed like a really stupid indulgence to spend money we didn't have, so I could go and look at an exhibition of a guy who's, I've got loads of his work in the house I can look at, you know, and I never went. They asked me for a quote, and they actually sent me it's a big green coloured book with a red squiggly transmorphing figure on it, and which apparently they're quite rare, and that was really nice. But I didn't go. My wife kept saying, go, she's like, go and see it. And I was like, no, it's just, I love his work. I'm inspired by it. I don't need to spend money we don't have to go to Paris to wander about on my own looking at, you know, and I never went. And there's a wee part of me that kind of wishes I did go, you know. And there's another part of me that thinks, you know what, it wouldn't have made any difference. He's not going to inspire me more just because I happen to be in an exhibition of his stuff, you know. But I can't remember what the question was, but
I wondered if Mobius was somebody that you knew and had a relationship with.
No, he was just a guy that drew these drawings that inspired me, you know.
What was the scene like your local scene, like, I don't know, like the Scottish scene or a more specific scene? What was it like when you started? How's it changed since then?
That's a good question. It was really exciting when we started. I didn't know anything about comics. I had read British comics when I was growing up. So that was like, when I was young, it was the Beano and the Beezer and the Dandy and things like that, which were published by a Dundee publisher, DC Thompson. Dundee is a city in the east coast of Scotland. They made all the comics for the UK. Then when I was a little bit older, I was reading The Bullet, which was a kind of anthology title that had a spy, it had a war story, and it had a football story and all that kind of stuff. Soccer story, I should say. And I kind of drifted away from comics, like as I kind of entered my teens. And during my teens, I was only really reading Mad Magazine, and it was old Mad magazines. I had a friend who had really cool big brothers and sisters, and they had loads of Mad magazines from the 70s. And there was all these amazing Jack Davis and Mort Drucker like movie spoofs of movies that I hadn't actually seen. Like I saw the movie spoofs for The Godfather or The Oddfather, as it was in Mad, long before I actually saw the movies, you know. And
Sparta took
and I also, there was the place that I went on holiday. It was a village called Millport on an island, really, well, just down the river from Glasgow. There was a cafe with a spinner rack, and it had sinister tales and weird science and creepy worlds and all that kind of stuff printed in really thick, heavy newsprint. And God, I loved them. And it had Steve Ditko, and it had a whole bunch of quite a variety of artists. But I wasn't at all au fait with modern comic books, and I went to Glasgow School of Art. I did a fine art degree. I got chucked out halfway through, and there's no interesting story there. I just didn't do enough work. And I started freelancing in Glasgow, just as an I'll do anything kind of artist. And funnily enough, one of the things that I did was we've got a kind of a market that sells new and second-hand goods, and it's called the Barras, and there was a guy in the Barras that had a t-shirt stall, and we've got two soccer clubs in Glasgow, Celtic and Rangers, and Celtic are the majority of their supporters are Catholics, and Rangers, the majority of them are Protestant or Church of Scotland, and there's a ridiculous amount of rivalry between them. And this guy wanted to do Celtic and Rangers t-shirts using American wrestlers, and I had to do line drawings of Hulk Hogan and Jake the Snake holding blank scarves, and they would put the green, white, and gold, or the red, white, and blue. So it's the Irish flag or the British flag colours, and yeah, I was doing murals for Indian restaurants. I was doing t-shirt designs. I was doing all sorts of I was doing caricatures for people that were retiring, and I was doing all sorts of work. And and somebody told me there was a printers in the Merchant City area of Glasgow that was looking for an artist. And I went down with my portfolio, and I had all these freelance jobs that I'd done, and I had all these photographs of oil paintings and life drawings and monoprints from what I'd been doing at art school. I thought they were looking for an artist, and they were like, no, we're putting together an adult humor comic kind of underground thing, and we need guys that we don't have any writers, so we need guys that can write and draw their own stories. So as soon as I was trying to make it as a freelance artist, in any area, like murals, t-shirt designs, album covers, book illustration, anything that I could do. And but it wasn't full time, so I had the time, and I thought I used to like comics, and I've never done a comic before, so I started writing and drawing these comedy strips. And right away, I started finding out that there was a community of people in Glasgow that were writing and drawing and publishing comics, and the various different comic shops in the city. I think there were 3 or 4 at the time. Were very, very supportive of anybody that was doing that kind of thing, and then there was a comic club that was created, and it was called Scam, and it was Scottish. It was SCCAM. It was Scottish Cartoonists and Comic Artist Members or something, and we would meet in the same pub, Blackfriars, which has just shut down through COVID. We would meet in Blackfriars in the basement once a month. I think it was a Wednesday night, and we would just drink and talk about comics. And Grant Morrison and Mark Miller would go there, and occasionally we would have Alan Grant and John Wagner and Cam Kennedy and people like that turning up as guests. And we, by some strange set of circumstances, we got Will Eisner to be the president of the club. And every year, Will and his wife went over to Ireland to visit close friends or family members. So we managed to get Will Eisner to come over to the Scam Club, and we only needed to pay for a short flight from Ireland to Scotland and put him up in a hotel for 2 nights, and funnily enough, I had started at this point. I had moved on from Electric Soup to the Judge Red magazine, and Will Eisner was willing to do folio reviews. Now, there must have been over 100 people that were registered in the Scam Club. And I was one of the guys. I mean, there was people like Gary Erskine and Colin McNeil who were working for Marvel and DC. There was Alan Grant and John Wagner that were like Cam Kennedy and oh God, what's his name that did From Hell?
Eddie Campbell.
Thank you, Eddie Campbell. There was all these people that were like Scottish people that were like miles ahead in comics, but there was a bunch of us that were just starting out and were just starting to get a foothold in 2000 AD or Judge Red magazine or Vertigo or Paradox Press. You know, so we were all kind of starting out, and there was a bunch of people that were still just doing independent stuff. So there was loads of people that had folios and they wanted Will's advice, and so it was decided that everybody could only present 2 pages. So I picked what I thought were my 2 best pages, and it was pages from the Judge Red magazine, and one of them was from a Western strip called Missionary Man, and it was my favourite page, and he's blasting with his guns, he's blasting through this canyon full of rednecks and mutants. And the other one was from a thing called Shimura. It's a kind of Japanese strip, and it was about this guy that was slowly turning into a kind of cyborg, and they were big watercolor paintings, and I was super proud of them, and I waited in line for ages to get words of wisdom from Will Eisner, and when I got to the table, he looked at the pages and he nodded and he said, "These are good. These are very good." And I was like, "Any pointers?" And he said, "Yes." He said, and he pointed at one of the main panels, and he said, "Try and keep the focus of attention in the center of the panel." They gave me my pages back and said, "Next." I wanted to say, you know, like, come on, give me more. I've been waiting for an hour, you know, and I was really quite disappointed, and then I realised a couple of years down the line that I nearly always put the centre of focus in. I put the focus of attention in the centre of the panel, unless there's a good. And I know the rule of thirds and stuff, but I've got this thing about always putting it in the centre. I'm trying to get away from it now, but I had the pleasure of Mark Miller and I get invited to Barcelona when we were doing The Authority, and Will Eisner and his wife were guests, and the convention was, I think the convention was only 2 days, and we were there for like 5 days or a week or something, and they took all the guests round in like a kind of minibus, a tour of the city, seeing all the Gaudi architecture and stuff like that, and the whole time Will Eisner really took to me and Mark, and it might be because we were English speakers and everybody else was Spanish, but obviously I felt special. But now that I think of it, it was probably just a language thing. But he was such a natural storyteller, and he told us all these amazing stories about his life and about his life in comics and about the things that had happened. And he was just the nicest guy. He was such good company. And of course, he told us the famous story about the 2 Jewish kids that come up to his publishing place, you know, with this idea they had about a guy that could jump higher than a building and run faster than a train and all that kind of stuff. And he had like looked at it and said it was very interesting, but they did crime comics and romance and war comics and stuff, and he wished them all the best. And saw them out the door and they turned round, and all the guys that were sitting at their desks drawing, they just turned round and they all just started laughing, going, jumps higher than a building, and they just started. And the very next year, it was the biggest selling thing in the world, you know. But he was such good company, you know. It was such a treat to have that wee moment with him, you know.
When you met him early on, were you familiar with his comics? Like obviously the name meant a lot, but were you able to access his comics?
Yeah, the first thing I was shown was The Spirit, and I really liked. You know that way when you're starting out and you don't really have a handle on everything, you make some really rash assumptions. Well, I was the king of that sort of stuff. And I remember seeing The Spirit and going, the title pages are really good, but the rest of it's really boring. And then I saw Contract with God, and it just struck a chord. I was like, this is genius. And it was the same with the first time I saw Akira. I was working, when I started with Electric Soup, I didn't know anything about comics. And there was a couple of the guys were right into comics, and one of them was a guy called Rob McCallum. And Rob did some stuff for 2000 AD. After Electric Soup, he did some stuff for the Judge Dredd magazine. And then he did a couple of things for DC, and he did something for Excelsior, Stan Lee's offshoot thing. And then he got into storyboarding, and he's just he lives in Canada now, and he's a big deal storyboarding guy. And he did Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead or whatever it was with George Romero. And he's working on Star Trek just now. He's done so many big deal movies now. But it was Rob that showed me The Spirit, and I was like, And he also showed me Akira, and it was like I presume it was the epic, the slim volumes where you get however many pages you got. And it was that part in the story where the warship with that small team of experts is coming in across the ocean from wherever they're coming from, and Tetsuo goes on to the warship and morphs with one of the planes, you know, and it's just stunning. And there's also a scene with somebody in a prison cell behind bars. And I remember looking at this stuff, and some of it was, this was probably I think it was my first introduction to manga at all. And I remember looking at this and thinking, this guy is phenomenal at drawing everything. But when he draws faces, they kind of look like cartoon masks. I had no point of reference for these big eyes and the simplicity of the faces, and particularly in close-up. You know, like you'd see a guy that was morphing with a fighter jet, and it was like the best drawing you'd ever seen. And then you'd see somebody standing behind bars with this big mask-like face, and you'd be like, is this the same guy? You know, and it took me, I don't know, it didn't take me that long, you know, he's a genius. It took me a while to kind of get on board with that aesthetic. And then once I got it, I was like, oh my God, this is tremendous. But yeah, the Glasgow comic scene was, everybody kind of knew each other. And there was people at different levels, but there didn't seem to be much distinction, you know, socially. And it was, I don't know, it was an exciting time. There was some of us kept going in comics and trying to get more of a foothold, and there was other people that went off into the games industry. We've got quite a strong games industry here. And some people went into animation or storyboarding, and, you know, but we all kind of knew each other, and, you know, it was exciting. It was a good time.
I think it's really fascinating that you get into comics late. And for my money, you're one of the best visual storytellers working in the game right now. I wonder if you could speak about maybe some of the storytelling influences that you've developed over time. Does it come from film? What sort of areas of storytelling sort of help, inspire your imagination when it comes to that part of the process for you?
When I started out, the comic, I mean, obviously I had read a bunch of the old creepy, eerie, sinister tales, weird science stuff. I'd read a bunch of Mad Magazine, which is weird because it doesn't work like normal sequential comics. It's very much going from scene to scene, so it's little vignettes, like in sequence. A There's a Scottish artist, Dudley D. Watkins, who did the Bruins, which was a family comedy, and Oor Wullie, which was a wee boy that get into scrapes and capers. And these were really simple one-page Sunday newspaper strips. When I went from Electric Soup, which was comedy stuff, to the Judge Dredd magazine, where I was actually just being given a script that somebody else had written and trying to follow it, my main concerns were about keeping it clear. My biggest goal, apart from trying to make key panels like somebody's head exploding look as cool as possible, my main concern was with, imagine you looked at this without the word balloons on it. Would you be able to have a good idea of what was happening? That was my idea. So it was all to do with clarity, and it partly came from comics. It partly came from television and cinema. It largely came from working with a script that had been written that had descriptions of what the writer had in mind, what they wanted me to draw in each panel. And I suppose, I look back in my earlier work, and there's hardly a thing I wouldn't do differently now. Some of it works reasonably well, some of it not so much. But I did all the big books for Paradox Press, all those black and white short stories, and I did Flex Mentalo and 2020 Visions for Vertigo, and then I got my first crack at the DC Universe stuff, and it was a Lobo story. I was at a convention in Glasgow, and I'd met Alan Grant a couple of times, and Alan Grant's just one of the most amazing characters you could meet. His stories are outrageous. He's got stories, not just about comics. He's just got stories about things that have happened in his life, which would make your jaw drop. But I had been, at the time, Alan was writing Shadow of the Bat and Lobo. And it was when comics were selling very well. And Alan was like this big deal guy, like certainly locally. And he lived in a mansion and all the rest of it. And he said, I've seen your work in the Judge Dredd magazine. It's really good. And he said to me, he didn't say if you ever want to work together or if you ever want to, he said, if you ever want me to write a story for you, just let me know. And I was like, well, yeah, I'd love that. And he said, well, he said, would you be interested in drawing Lobo? And he told me later the reason he'd said that is because he wanted me to draw a Batman story, and his editors went, no way, this guy's not a superhero artist. He can't do superheroes. He's not ready for that. And he said, would you be interested in drawing a Lobo story? And I was like, I'm reading your Lobo every month. And I was. I loved it when it was Simon Bisley that was drawing Lobo, because so different from my work, but I loved Simon Bisley's work. And funnily enough, Simon Bisley's work sometimes seemed really good and easy to follow, and other times it was really it was just him drawing what he wanted, and Alan told me years later that Keith Giffen used to do the layouts, and if Simon stuck to Keith's layouts, it made perfect sense, because Simon wasn't a storyteller; he was just a drawer, and but sometimes Simon would just do his own thing because he's mad, and then it'd be difficult to follow. And there was a brilliant one. There was a brilliant Lobo that Alan Grant and John Wagner co-wrote, and it was Un-American Gladiators, and Cam Kennedy drew it. Do you guys know this one? That's, yeah, I love. Anyway, I'd been following Shadow of the Bat and Lobo every month, and I was like, yeah, I'd love that. And he said, well, what sort of story do you want? And I was working at the time with Robbie Morrison on a thing for the Judge Dredd magazine. It was Shimura. It was a kind of Japanese thing, and it was all lasers and weapons and shit like that. I mean, the thing I did was I didn't put any people in the streets, because it was quicker to draw empty streets than full streets. And I look back at it now, and it's meant to be Neo Tokyo, and there's not a person. All the streets are empty. But I said to Alan, you know, I'd really like something that didn't have any tech in it. You know, I'd like just hand-to-hand combat. And he went, right, hand-to-hand combat, and he went away and he wrote this story, and it was called The Hand-to-Hand Job. And it was about the publisher of a men's magazine, like a nude mag. And he gets kidnapped by hominists. And this was there was a thing going on in America at the time. I think he was called Iron John or Iron somebody, and it was a group of men that were hugging trees and getting together in the forests and trying to reclaim manhood, and but they were kind of like new men. They were kind of like feminists, and so they, in Alan's story, they were really against like nude magazines, like kind of Playboy style magazines, and so they kidnapped this guy, and Lobo had to go and get him back, and through some stupid plot twist, he had no weapons, so it was hand-to-hand combat. And the guy got eaten by a crocodile. It was only his hand that was left, but it was only his hand that he needed for the palm print to open the safe to get the plates out for the next issue. And it was a really good script. It was a really good story. It was really funny. The dialogue was really funny. The action was great, and it was called The Hand-to-Hand Job. And the story that I heard was that it was Dan Raspler that was editing, and the story I heard was that Paul Levitz had gone into Dan Raspler's office to see what he was doing, because he didn't like Lobo, because it wasn't his thing. He didn't like that type of comic, you know. And understandably, I mean, Paul Levitz is he's had a really significant contribution to comics, and you know, like, he's just got his own taste, and that's fine. But he looked at this script, and he was like, I don't know is this mature readers? Is this? And he didn't like it. And he said, why is it called The Hand-to-Hand Job? And Dan was like, it's it's that kind of magazine. It's hand-to-hand combat. It's a play in words. He's like, what do you mean? And he's like, hand job.
Oh, Paul knows what that shit means, man.
No, well, yeah. Well, that's a different story. But Dan Raspler's version of the story was that Paul said, what does that mean? And Dan explained it, and he went, we're not publishing that. And that was it. It was buried. So I don't know. I don't know if Dan Raspler's I don't know if he's an accurate source, if he's a good narrator or not. But it never got published. And then after that, Alan came up with this thing, The Scottish Connection. It was a Batman story, and he had read a book called The Hiram Key, and it was written by two guys that were Freemasons, and they had been Freemasons for years, and they had started revealing some of the secrets and became persona non grata with the Freemasons. And they wrote a book called The Hiram Key, which basically made a connection between the ancient architects of like Babylon and Solomon's Temple and all the rest of it, right up to the modern Freemasonry movement. And Alan was obsessed with this stuff, and he wrote a story, and it was a Bruce Wayne story, not a Batman story. And Bruce Wayne was on holiday, and he came to Scotland to see the grave of an ancestor. The corners of the gravestones were missing. He put them together, realized it was a map or a pattern, uncovered the mystery, a big conspiracy about the Freemasons, and solved the mystery, and went back home and never put his bat costume on. And he felt it was the best Batman story he ever wrote. And his editors were just like, where's Batman? Get him in a costume. So he rewrote it, and he didn't like it as much. And they sent it back. That's better, but we need a bad guy. So Alan Grant rewrote it with a bad guy and sent it back. And they're like, okay, it's better, but there's no fight. We need to see Batman hitting the bad guy. We need a punch in the jaw. And it went on like this. And eventually, like, Alan rewrote it 4 or 5 times. And the version that's out, the script that I get sent, Alan was so fed up with it. He was so done with it, and he hated it. And but he didn't tell me that, because he knew I'd never drawn Batman before, so it was a big deal to me. And so I got this Batman script in, and I did the very best job I could, and Matt Hollingsworth coloured it, and it came out. And for years I'd been working in comics, and your aunts and uncles would say, what you drawing? And you'd tell them it's 2020 visions about whatever. And or you'd be in a taxi, and they'd say, what do you do? I draw comics. What do you draw? Flex Mentallo. And they're like, and now I was drawing Batman, and all of a sudden it was like everybody was interested. So I gave this one to my mum, because I couldn't give the Vertigo stuff to my mum, or the Electric Soup stuff or anything, because she wouldn't have liked that. And so I gave her the Batman comic, and the next time I saw her, I was like, what do you think? And she went, oh, Vincent, your drawings were very, very good. She said, but the story was rubbish. And so of course I picked up the phone, I phoned Alan, I was like, guess what my mum just said? And Alan was killing himself laughing. He's like, tell your mum she's right. And that's when he told me for the first time that he had rewritten it loads of times and ended up hating it, because it was nothing like the story he wanted to tell. And he's like, tell your mum she was right. And I was like, all right.
So where's this hand-to-hand job thing now? Do you have slightly off camera, like the stack of pages you drew? Like where is this thing?
Yeah, I've still got, I drew it in blue line when I was actually using non-repro blue pencils, and they are very faint. I scanned some of them and tried to contrast the scans as much as possible for a talk that I did at somewhere, a con or a college or a university or something. One of the reasons I scanned some of the pages was because and this gets back to the original question of 10 minutes ago about storytelling and where I learned it. Working with Dan Raspler was a real turning point for me, because I sent the Lobo pages. I think it was 24 pages of blue pencils. And this was, I mean, every job that I take on, I mean to make it the best thing I've done. It's always, this is going to be, I'm going to show everybody what I can do. And it never works out that way, but that's always the intention. So when I got the Lobo script, this was the biggest, highest profile gig that I'd been offered. I was at that point in my career, which you're always at, where I had the most experience I'd had to that point, and I was going to put everything into this and make it the very best I could. And I did these pages, and I honestly thought Dan Raspler was going to phone me up as soon as he arrived and tell me that I was the greatest thing. And it was FedEx, so I knew it was going to take a day or two, and he didn't get in touch. And a whole week went past, and when he eventually phoned me, his opening line was, "Dude, I don't know how to tell you this." And he was just like, you're really good at drawing. I can see how much work you've put into this, but it's just fucking lame. It's just like, this is a Lobo comic. Like, we're supposed to have extreme close-ups, tilt the camera. It's like, this is like Tintin. Everything's a medium shot. Like, there was a 3-page fight sequence, and I had a fixed camera angle and a medium shot so you could see both figures, and I had choreographed the whole thing. So somebody was throwing a right hook and they're stepping in with their left foot first, and he said, "I've actually gone through it multiple times. I can see everything you've done. I can see the thought you've put into it. I could cut it out and make a flick book and it would be really, really satisfying. But it's not a Lobo comic. It's like, go and look at a Lobo comic." He said, once you've got an establishing shot of two guys squaring up, the first punch that's thrown can be a close-up with a tooth coming out, just a fist and a tooth. You don't need to see the two full figures. And to his credit, he sent me a typed, printed out, 5-10 pages of points, just going through all the pages, page 4, panel 2 and 3, blah, blah, blah. And he telling me everything that the script had asked me to do, that I had done, and what I should have done. And it changed the way I read scripts. It changed the way I interpreted scripts. And I had a big exhibition in Kelvin Grove Art Gallery, which is it's a big civic. It's the biggest civic art gallery in Glasgow, and they've got paintings from every era. They've also got a dinosaur room and an Egyptian room and so it's a museum and art gallery, and but they have a large basement space where they do rotating temporary exhibitions, and they try and do things to encourage people that don't normally go to museums or art galleries. So sometimes they do stuff about soccer, and sometimes they do stuff about film or TV, and and so they did a big exhibition of my stuff, and it was 6 months over the summer months, the busy period, and it turned out it was their second most successful exhibition. But they put on this huge exhibition of my work, and Martin Craig, the curator who curated the whole show, he went through all my back catalogue of originals, all my illustrated, because all my scripts, I've still got all the scripts. Everything's out of order and stuffed into polythene bags, and he couldn't believe my filing system. But he went through everything. It took him months. He went through everything, put everything into order, and when he found the letter from Dan Raspler telling me everything that I'd done wrong, he was like, "Would you mind this going in the show?" And I was like, "No, it's really significant to me." And it was one of the things in the show that got the most comments. It was just an editor just going, "You're good at drawing, but you don't know how to tell a story. What are you thinking? Think about it this way." And we had the pages of his letter in a glass vitrine in the middle of a room it was the exhibition was over multiple rooms in the basement, and yeah, I mean, it was like loads of people really responded to that. It's just, here's a young artist that doesn't really know what he's doing, and here's a wise old editor saying, this is what you need to be thinking about. And
Context helps though, it's sort of like you showed him.
Right,
Look-
right. It
look
makes
where you're
him look
reading this letter.
like the asshole for writing that letter. Yeah.
I think that's a super inspiring thing to show off to
Yeah,
people,
for
because
sure.
I think that your average comics fan or your average fan of story media, whatever, a lot of people assume that what they're reading is just first draft. Like, they sat down and they made this thing. You see something like that, it says a lot about you, Frank, in as much as like ego is concerned, because certain people could just be like, oh, what the fuck does that guy know, man? Bollocks. Or you pay attention, senpai kohai, you pay attention to the old timer, you take some things from it, and then you grow from it. It's like a Phil Jackson coaching moment.
Is that available online anywhere, that letter?
I don't know if it is or not. I'll dig it out and I'll send it to you. It would make more sense if I could also get the original pages. And for that 3-page fight scene, which was all from a fixed angle. I mean, it was an old-fashioned black and white movie with two guys boxing. I mean, it was, and I look back, I'm actually embarrassed. It's so unlike a Lobo comic. It was like a flick book. He was absolutely right. But I redrew those 3 pages with extreme close-ups, with tilting the camera angle, and with the establishing shot at the start, it totally made sense and it was much more dynamic. So I totally got where he was coming from. But I didn't implement all the changes that he made simply because at some point in the process, we were told that the thing wasn't going to get published. So that was the end of it. But I'll certainly see what I can dig out. If I can scan the pages and contrast them. I mean, it's embarrassing because it's, when you see what I did wrong, it's like so obvious what I was doing wrong, But I didn't go to the Kubert school, I was learning as I went along, and I'm surprised at how obvious some of the mistakes I made were. But the thing is, what you're saying, it's not really about ego. I read Dan's notes, and there wasn't, to his credit, there wasn't a single suggestion that he made that I thought, oh, no, that's not right. Every single thing that he suggested was right, and it was better than what I'd done. And a couple of years prior to that, when I was working on 2020 Visions, I can't remember who edited. It might have been Axel Alonso, who's a brilliant editor, but somebody sent me notes, and it wasn't Axel. Somebody sent me notes about changes that I should make to that. And there was like 10 suggestions, and I went through them all. And this was before I'd worked with Dan Rasper. So this was before I had changed my way of thinking about storytelling. And they were like, zoom in 20%, zoom out 40%. I mean, it was like really, and one of them was, there was 3 characters in a panel, and all 3 of them were speaking, and it was suggested that I zoom in on the one that was sitting down. And I was like, well, what about the other 2 that have got dialogue? Are the balloons just going to come in? And I got back to Axel and said, like, there's only a couple of these I agree with. The rest don't make a significant difference, and there's 1 or 2 that make it worse. And he just got back to me and said, do the ones that you think improve it. And, that'll be it. Yeah, it's a strange thing. They apparently years ago, like before royalties, artists would be able to make more money by becoming editors, and then with their experience, they could nurture younger artists. And for I don't know how many generations now, editors are almost always they have a writing background, or they aspire to be writers, Very, very few editors I've worked with are artists themselves or have any real experience with the art side of storytelling. So it's I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, I kind of wish that I had started at a time where editors were artists and they could have guided me better, because I remember speaking to Dave Gibbons, and he was saying that when he started out, he would draw a story and send it in, and they would send it back to him, send the original artwork back with big pieces of tracing paper on top and all these notes written on it. And it was things like, like, if we're going to see a key going into a door, we need to see the lock and the door on the panel before it. And it was like, and he couldn't sign his work back in those days. And he said he's now glad that he didn't. But he said, like, it was real, like, if something happens in this panel, you need to know why in the panel before. And I remember, again, with Dan Rasper, I remember him saying that Dave Gibbons was the best meat and potatoes storyteller in comics. And he said he's never going to knock your socks off, but you will never, ever have to go back a page to work out what's going on. And over the years, the number of times I've picked up a piece of Dave Gibbons' work, particularly Watchmen, just to look at the storytelling, and then 5, 10, 20 minutes later, I've gone through all these pages because I'm just reading it again, and you just get drawn into a flow. I mean, he's a phenomenal storyteller. He really is. He's an absolute master of just leading you along and doing all the work for you. So I feel I've actually learned a lot from looking at his work.
Frank, any plans to write a book on storytelling?
No, there's a number of colleges and universities and art schools in Scotland that do comic book courses, sequential art courses, and so on at degree level. And a number of times I've been invited to go and speak, and typically I'll have a selection of images, and I'll talk through my process and why I made the decisions I made, and why it works the way it works. And I enjoy doing that because I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. So particularly if I've had time to prepare and I've got examples, I find it very easy to break it down. For all that I'm very methodical in the way I work, I'm very, very disorganized in general. I'm a very, very messy person. Nothing that I own, from the stuff that I've got in my pockets to the tons of stuff that I've got in my studio, nothing is in order. Everything is just a jumble. So if I were to do a book like on my version of how to do storytelling, I would need to work with somebody much more methodical than myself, who could help me choose, like the way Martin Craig worked with me to put the exhibition together. I would need somebody to actually help me structure that. I don't feel I've got the set of skills necessary to put it all together myself.
What's his email? Send him a request. I mention it because, doing some research for this, it strikes me that you are very thoughtful about the storytelling part. And that is it's a nuanced part of comics. It's my favorite part of comics, but it's also the part you see least talked about often. Whenever you hear people talking about comics, it's often art, characters, writing, but it's not necessarily storytelling. It's a hard subject to explain. I think, you say having some visual examples certainly helps. But it's one of those topics like I can't get enough of it. So when I meet a cartoonist that seems interested in that subject, I'm always eager to kind of like, yeah, share what you know. It's a topic I'm definitely very interested in.
Me too. I mean, Ed hinted at it earlier with the hypnotherapist thing. A few years back, I was doing Pax Americana, and I was halfway through Pax Americana and hadn't finished it because it was taking so long, and I was due to start Jupiter's Legacy, and I ended up doing both projects together. And I can normally, at best, I can do 2 pages a week. And I was doing 2 projects at the same time, but I wasn't managing to do as much as 1 page a week. It was the slowest, productivity wise, it was the slowest point in my career. And conversely, I was working the longest hours I've ever worked. I was working like 14, 16, 18 hours a day. I just couldn't get through the work. And Grant kept phoning me up saying, Vin, what are you doing? Why are you not getting the work done? And Mark was the same. And I was saying, I read the script and I can see so many different ways of doing it. And I'm doing like 4, 6, 8 thumbnails for every panel. And then I'm choosing different thumbnails to put the page together. And depending on which ones I pick, and Grant said to me, he was like, Vin, you've been drawing comics for more than 20 years. You're good at it now. Trust your instincts. And he said to me, how often do you try all these different things and go back to either the first or the second thing you've done? And I was like, all the time. It's always the first or the second. Is that right? He said, try stopping after you've done 2 or 3 versions and choose one of them. And I couldn't. In my mind, I'd got to the stage where I was so into the storytelling. It was kind of like in my mind I was giving a class, like doing a lecture, and these were all different permutations of how you could tell this story page based on this 1 page of script. And Grant was like, you've got a wife and 3 kids. You need to get the work done. I want this out. Trust yourself. And I couldn't. And Mark phoned me up and went, tell me what's going on. What are you doing? And I told him, and he went, there was a big pause, and he went, would you see a hypnotherapist? And I was like, yeah, okay. He was like, one of my neighbours, he's retired now, but he's a really successful hypnotherapist. He's helped people stop drinking. He's helped people stop smoking. You know, like, maybe he could help you. And the guy was called Ronald. I can't remember his second name. He's a very pleasant, posh old gentleman.
Donald.
And he came over to my house, and he said, a lot of people see a hypnotherapist, and it's like having a therapist. It's something they do every week, and it just becomes like a crutch. It's part of their life. It's part of their routine. He said, if I can't cure you in 3 sessions, you know, let's not do any more. And so I had 3 sessions with Ronald, and he said, tell me what's happening. So I explained it all to him, and he said, I'm going to put you in a light trance. And he said, I want you to put your hands on the sides of the chair, uncross your legs, shut your eyes, relax, listen to my voice. And then he was saying, he said, like, I want you to imagine that your eyelids are heavy. And the thing is, he told me before we started, it's not going to be like magic. It's not going to be like you're in a trance. It's just go along with it. Just give into it. And he was saying, your eyelids are heavy. You could probably open them if you tried, but you're not going to try because they feel slightly heavier than normal. And I just totally went along with it. And he told me that I was good enough to trust myself. I had enough experience. Everything that Grant had already said to me, but what does Grant know? You know, and he gave me a CD of a recording that he made. And he said, anytime you feel you're slipping, listen to this recording, and it's 3 sessions with this guy, and I was back to trusting my instincts and doing my 2 pages a week and not spending extra days doing all these other permutations. But yeah, I mean, I would kind of like to do the teaching thing, because I enjoy teaching. I prefer making to teaching, but I do enjoy teaching. It's maybe for the opposite side of the fact that I enjoy listening to other people who are better than me, or who've got more experience than me, or who've just got a different experience. Because I also get inspiration from younger people. I get inspiration from people that work in a much looser style than me, or people that are technically better than me, or whatever. It's like, I'm sure you guys are the same. You get inspiration from a lot of different places, and you pick and choose your teachers. So, I would, at some point, I would maybe like to do some kind of teaching beyond what I've already done.
It's interesting because, like, it seemed to me the point of Pax Americana was to put a watchman's amount of effort into one issue of a comic. So this, like, behind the fact that Grant was surprised that it was taking you a while to do this, and then the fact that you actually did go like as deep as that.
Yeah, this is a huge sarcastic oversimplification, but Grant did a Pax Americana just to kind of show Alan Moore that you could do something like that much simpler in 40 pages. It was almost a snub, whereas for me, like, much as I loved the story of Watchmen, the way the story unfolds visually, I mean, like, for me, Dave Gibbons is like, he's up there with the very best of them. And, like, for me, coming on to Pax Americana was much more of a homage to Dave Gibbons rather than a snub to Alan Moore. So we did approach it from a somewhat different standpoint.
You said it a couple of times throughout the conversation. You said Vin, mom said Vincent. Where does Frank Quitely come from?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's interesting, but it's when I, like yourself, Ed, I was brought up Catholic. I had very, very loving, devoted Catholic parents, and I got involved with this adult humor comic, Electric Soup, and by today's standards, it would be seen as being somewhat misogynistic, a little bit racist, just predictable, laddish, off-color humor. And I don't feel that my work was like that. I was fresh out of art school. I'm a pretty open-minded, open-hearted kind of guy. But I was slightly embarrassed by some of the content of the comic, and some of the other guys in the comic were taking on pseudonyms, either because they were already working and they didn't want it to interfere tax-wise or whatever. And I had the name Frank Quitely in my mind for a year or two, because I had accidentally said Frank Quitely when I meant quite frankly. And obviously, quite frankly means to be honest. And the idea of using the name Frank Quitely to hide behind, there was a kind of irony there that I thought quite suited working for an adult humor comic. So I was also, at that time when I left art school, before I got established as an artist, I was in receipt of a thing called supplementary benefit. And it was, because I'd been a student, I had never worked full time. So I didn't qualify for unemployment benefit when I didn't have a job. I got the lesser supplementary benefit, which was much closer to pocket money. And I would have lost that had they realized I was making any kind of money or doing any kind of job. So the combination of not wanting to lose that little bit of government support that I had, and also not wanting to upset my parents with doing something that was somewhat distasteful. It seemed like the perfect thing to use this comedy name to hide behind. And this is pre-internet, so in the UK we had Comics International and Comics World and Comics something else. There was various trade magazines that did reviews, not just on all the big new stuff that was happening, but also on indie stuff and local stuff. And although much of Electric Soup got universally panned by critics, there were a few things. There were a few artists that worked in it, myself included, that got fairly favourable reviews. So the Frank Whiteley name had started kind of seeping out there, and so when I started working for the Judge Dredd magazine, I thought I'm going to keep using this name, and I just kept it. So,
technical question for this video, since I'm the editor here, do we leave the part about the tax stuff, man?
Yeah, are the authorities gonna break into your?
Because I certainly don't want to bring any trouble. Like we have statutes of limitations here, man, but I don't know if that ever applies to taxes here. The feds want their money.
No, well, the thing is, what I was trying to avoid was a tax inspection. When we did Electric Soup, it was a bunch of guys who'd never made a comic before that got together to make a comic. There was a comic that was very big in the UK. It was an English comic called Viz, and it was a kind of magazine. So we were trying to do something in that vein, but that was more comic strip and less editorial. We started with nothing. We found a printer that was willing to print the comic on spec, and we would pay them back when we had sold enough comics to pay their bill. And we were left with a very small amount of cash, which went towards the next printing bill. So we only had to come up with half of it from sales. And after we'd done 6 or 7 issues, we had got to the stage where we had enough money to pay for the printing bill and enough money for all of us to go out for drinks and a curry, like an Indian meal. And then John Brown, who was an English publisher, took us over, and we got a colour cover, and we got UK-wide distribution in national newsagents. So there was one issue where we actually made royalties, and then the sales went down every month until we eventually scrapped it. So no, you can keep this part in. It doesn't matter. There was no significant money made that would affect taxes or anything like that.
Frank, you've talked about income from comics a couple of times in this talk, and I wonder if you ever considered leaving comics, or if you considered compromising the quality of your work to try to get faster, to try to do, I don't know, a page a day is what a lot of freelancers that do Marvel DC work will talk about. Were those things that you considered?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, comics don't pay a lot, and I've got a wife and 3 kids, so I need a certain amount of money. I have often tried to work faster, but there's this thing. I mean, I've heard you guys speaking about it before in some of your other talks about artists who could maybe try loosening up and don't manage it, and there's a lot of examples in my work where I look at it and think, oh, this is it's overworked, or it's overwrought, or it's tight or whatever. And there's lots of bits and pieces in my work that I don't like very much, but I'm more dissatisfied with the stuff that's not good enough when I've spent ages on it than the stuff that's not good enough when it's a bit too loose or a bit, you know, where I've not tried hard enough or I've cut corners. You know, there's something about failing when you've tried too hard that seems worse than failing when you've not tried hard enough. I've also got this thing that, you know, when you're invited onto a new project and you're given a new page rate, particularly when they put your page rate up, and you feel like, well, they expect a certain thing from me, and it makes it harder to try and do something more simple or more cartoony, or, you know, so I think I hold myself back from that point of view. I've also found that in my experience, I'm well aware of the fact that I have an aesthetic style that divides people. Like, some people like what I do and some people don't. Some people really don't like the look of my drawings, but they still can buy into the fact that I can tell a story. Other people just can't deal with it at all because they don't like how it looks. You know, like, you go to a convention, the people that wait at your table are people that like your work, so you only get compliments. But when you look online, you know, it's much more of a 50-50. There's lots of people out there that are just, this guy's rubbish. I don't know why he gets the respect that he deserves. Excuse me a second, I've just got a warming up, seeing my battery's low and I'm plugged in. I think I maybe hadn't switched on.
Well, if you got 50-50 good, bad online comments, then you're doing great. Because usually it's like 90-10.
Well, but yeah, there is I would like to try and do some strips where when I look at the loose thumbnails on the margins of the script, or when I look at the loose drawings I've got in my sketchbook, I often like, just personal taste wise, I often like them better than the sometimes tight-assed finished work that I put on the page. And I would like to do some comic strips where I'm working in a looser way. And I haven't felt at liberty to do that when I've been approached about new projects and they've given me a new page rate and everybody's excited about me getting started, and then I send them in something that looks really sketchy and half-assed or really, really simple, you know. So I'm going to have to try and do that with stuff that I just do for myself. We'll see.
Let's talk about some of that tight-assed, finished, slick work as compared to the thumbnails and stuff. Obviously, in the margin notes, you're not looking at figure reference or anything like this, man. You're just kind of getting gestural imagery down in the thumbnail stage. On top of the storytelling skills, I think your figure drawing is some of the most impeccable, beautiful figure drawing in comics. And I wonder a couple of things. I wonder if you keep up with life drawing or what your relationship is with that. And I wonder if the thing that sort of slows you down when you hit the final boards, are you looking at lots of reference for the figure in different twisted, angles and things to get the figures that we see in the printed page?
No, I don't work with a lot of reference. If I've got to draw the White House or a horse or a specific model of car, I need reference. But I try as much as possible. I try and draw. I look at the picture of the car and try to draw it from a different angle so that it looks more like a drawing. Mostly, I sometimes trace. I don't need a lot of reference for figures. I'll photograph my own hands if I need to. There's lots of hand positions that I can draw, no bother, from what I've got in my head. there are some positions that I just can't, and I've got to photograph my hands or somebody else's hands just because those positions are more difficult. Um, um, I learned to draw as a child using how to draw books. I had a book which wouldn't get published now called Drawing for Boys, and it was an American book, and it showed you how to draw like American football players and Cadillacs and ranches in perspective on the plains and all this kind of stuff. And I just ate that stuff up. And I remember like they would show you like 2 or 3 stages of the drawing, and it's like the Andrew Loomis books that I discovered more recently. And there's a guy that can draw the ass off anybody. But you see the half drawn form where all the fingers are like potato chips. They're like cuboids. They've got hard edges, and they just look amazing. And they draw the wee line that joins all these knuckles, and it's this lovely curve. And I love that stuff. And I learned to draw copying that stuff. And so I kind of draw like an animator where you've got a stick figure, and then you make them into kind of like cylindrical tubes or cuboids, and then you just start putting in roughly where the muscles are, and then you exaggerate the gesture. If they're wearing clothes, you exaggerate the gesture by putting the creases in the shirt or the jacket or whatever. So for the most part, I draw that way. If I can find a piece of reference that's close to what I want, I'll use it. But as much as possible, I try and just build it up from what I've got. And but still the largest part of the time is sorting out the composition and balancing things up. It's all the stuff that people don't necessarily notice, that seems to take the time. And I'm not, as I said about the hypnotherapy, I'm not nearly as bad as I used to be, but I want things to work. I want it going forward. I want to get to the stage where I'm not putting things down on the page that leave the reader feeling slightly like they're not 100% sure. That doesn't sit well with me. I need to be doing everything so that they can just look at it and it works, and not everything I've done works that way. Every now and again, I'll be talking to somebody and I'll realize that they don't quite get what it was I was doing. There was interestingly with the Pax Americana, there's a double page spread in the Peacemaker's home, and it's one big room in perspective. There's a few huge sculptural objects, and the question is going around with his torch and his dictaphone, talking about the crime after it's happened. There's the morning when the Peacemaker's girlfriend is asking him not to go, and there's the evening when the murderer comes in and kills the girlfriend. And it was Nathan Fairbairn that coloured it, and he did an outstanding job on the whole book. It's one of the best colouring jobs I've had. But on the double page spread, it wasn't obvious enough to me, and I'd been working on it for weeks, that double page spread. It wasn't obvious enough that it was 3 time zones. It looked like 2 time zones. And I asked him to change it, and he argued that we didn't need to patronise the reader. And I asked the editor and Grant to step in, and was it just me, or is this not obvious enough? And they both bowed out, and it went out. And I've read multiple reviews where people have said this is a really amazing piece of work. There's 2 or 3 time zones here, and you're like, it's not obvious enough. And when I've used those pages, like in teaching, I've actually scanned them in and picked one of the time zones and changed the colors to make it more readable. But I mean, that's me. Amazingly, that's me pointing out a feeling that I feel is somebody else's fault. There's other things that over the years that I've done where what I've drawn isn't clear enough, and I'm constantly, I'm striving to get to a stage where everything I do is like Dave Gibbons. Everything, you just read it and it's there. You don't need to think about it. It's just there. It all works. Like you don't need to go back a page to check what happened. But and I would also like to loosen up as well. And I'd also like to work in a variety of different styles. Some of them tight and controlled, some of them loose and sketchy, some of them black and white, some of them watercolor, some of them digital color. I'd like to do a variety of things.
What do you say, guys? Man, freaking great conversation. Yeah. It's got to be getting late there, close to dinner time or something. Frank, Vin, thank you so much for coming by. Thank you for investing some time with us, talking that smack. You guys good? You guys go.
Look at this.
What? Oh,
Look
hey,
at
cool.
this.
You got the
Look,
shit.
Jack Kirby, X-Men Grand Designs. Look at this. Fantastic Four.
Oh, cool.
This is a Red Room. This is my friend Jim Hamilton that runs Comics International. For ages I've been trying to pick up some of this stuff, and I said, "Can you get me anything from Ed and Jim and Tom?" And he's like, "Leave it with me." And he got a bunch of stuff from Ed and Tom, and he's like, "I'm sorry, I couldn't get any of Jim's stuff. Everything's sold out." So he's got somebody on it, Jim. I'm getting some of your stuff soon.
Highly sought after.
You're in for a treat. It'll get there eventually.
Just don't confuse things. My Red Room comics, family friendly, but I don't know about those Jim Rugg Street Angels, man. You might want to keep those to yourself, man. But share the Red Rooms with the fam. It's an educational experience.
Anything you want to point people to, Frank, where they can follow you online, recent works in print, something you want to point anybody at?
No, I've for years I had no social media, and when Jupiter's Legacy came out, I felt pressured into getting Instagram and Twitter because the whole machine behind Jupiter's Legacy, everybody involved, everybody was trying to support it on social media, and I just felt pressured into joining in. And I have tried to tweet things and put things up on Instagram, and I do it so rarely. I'm so rubbish at it. I can't really be bothered with it. I'm working on a kind of secret thing with Mark just now. It's quite short. I'm working on a couple of really interesting projects outside comics. I'm working with a whiskey distillery just now, a Scotch whiskey distillery, who approached me. They had a bunch of traditional myths and legends, and they wanted me to do drawings that would work in 4 panels when you turn the box that the whiskey bottle was in your hands, and they got the master blender to choose whiskies with tasting notes that matched the narrative and all this kind of thing. And so yeah, and I've also been writing a bunch of stuff as well, but I have nothing coming out imminently, and my social media is boring as hell. So it's like paint drying. So no, I've got nothing to plug.
Wrong. There is something. You have an art book that came out not too long ago. I think it's a collection of like maybe some sketchbook excerpts or something. I didn't know about it until I started looking into this episode. So do you want to tell us about that?
Oh yeah, there's a local publisher, BHP, Bold Hearted Press. They do some really interesting indie stuff, and they just before just before lockdown. They did with we went through some of my work, and some of it was work that you would have seen before. It was like covers and pages, and we talked through the process, the double page from Pax Americana, some of the Jupiter's Legacy covers and stuff. Some of it was sketchbook work, some of it was design work, some of it was theatre posters. We did a bunch of stuff, and they got me to, they put it all on an iPad and they flicked through it and they recorded me just talking about what it was I had in mind, and then they wrote that stuff down and edited it down, and so it's a kind of weird mashup between your typical artist sketchbook type thing with a bit of a how-to as well, and it's called Drawings and Sketches, Frank Whiteley Drawings and Sketches, and they printed a bunch of them, and the building that they were in was right beside the Glasgow School of Art Macintosh building, which burned down. Brad Pitt and Samuel L. Jackson, thank you both very much, put in a lot of money to rebuild the building. It's a top 10 building of architectural significance in the world. It's like a magnificent piece of architecture. But as a result of that fire, all the neighbouring buildings get shut, so all the printed books got locked up. So they had to go to a different printing and do soft covers, which then came out. And now they've done one with Charlie Adlard, and they're going to keep doing these as an ongoing thing. So yeah, there's a Frank Whiteley Drawing and Sketches book from BHP, which is a local Scottish publisher. Yeah, and if you're having trouble sleeping, you could check out my Twitter or Instagram.
Saw that one piece on Instagram. It was like a David Cho piece of fan art or something. Like what's the story behind that? Is that one of the secret things you're working on?
David Cho got in touch. What a character! I mean, he's like the polar opposite of me. He's like this amazing force of nature, free spirit, like honest to the point of turning himself inside out. And I'm like a clam. I can't tell anybody anything. I'm just like, I'm all closed up and private. And we talked, the first time we spoke, we talked on the phone for like an hour and a half. And he's so warm. He's so engaging. He's so creative. He's so intense. It was an amazing conversation. And he sent me, like ages ago, he sent me early edits of the show, and it was brilliant. And then we got talking about he was like asking me about like what we were talking about earlier about the fact that most of my work is pretty tight and pretty finished, and it looks like there's a bit of thought behind it. And he's like, have you not got anything shitty? Have you not got anything like have you not got anything that you just rattle off and and you wouldn't show anybody because it's rubbish? And I was like, I've got books full of stuff that I wouldn't show anybody. He's like, going to send me some. And he said, I used to do a lot of writing, and I've kind of not done any writing, and I feel like if I had a bunch of images, and he said I like really shitty bad drawings. He said, so if I had a bunch of images that had nothing to do with each other, I could make a story out of it. So I sent him, against my better judgment, I sent him a bunch of thumbnail sketches and excerpts out of my sketchbook and other doodles and things. And he wrote this hilarious story. And we talked about, do we bring this out as a really cheap like Xerox zine, or do we take it to to Tashin or somebody and make it into like a like a really high end art book, and we hadn't really decided, and then it kind of that project is just kind of in limbo, and then he got in touch and said the show is coming up. Would you be interested in doing a piece of artwork for me? And I need to have the paint in my face, I need to have the blonde hair, I need to have the Hawaiian shirt. Beyond that, do whatever you want. And I did a drawing that I coloured and I sent it to him, and he put out the black and white version, and loads of other people coloured it, and so that was kind of fun.
If you look closely, man, that paint can that Frank drew doesn't say Krylon, man. It says Kayfabe.
It does. I forgot about that. Yeah, it's because I didn't know about you guys until you. It was either until you interviewed either Mark Miller or Brendan McCarthy, and one of the two of them got in touch with me saying you need to see these guys, and that must have been around about the time of the first lockdown. And I mean, I listen to a lot of stuff when I'm working, but I think by a fair margin, like the Kayfabe stuff has been my most listened to thing all the way through lockdown. And there's loads of Kayfabes that I've listened to more than once, simply because when you're sitting working, another one just comes up, and you might have heard it before, but you hear, especially when you're not looking at it, you hear more while you're sitting drawing. And yeah, it's really weird doing this, because I kind of feel like I know you guys. It seems odd sitting talking, like to three guys I haven't met, but I kind of feel I know you. But yeah, I know loads of people that loads of guests you've come on have basically started off by saying you guys are doing an amazing job, don't stop doing what you're doing, and all the rest of it. And I didn't want to just reiterate what's been said so often, but it's such a good thing to hear people with very, very broad tastes like enthusing, and sometimes you're just enthusing, and sometimes you've been really insightful, but it's just listening into conversations like the conversations I have with other comic pals. It's inspiring and refreshing, and it's just it's great, and I hope you guys keep doing this.
Well, God damn it, that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to top that.